I come to the floor today because President Trump, his administration, and this Republican Congress are engaged in a heartless and deliberate plot to rip health care away from millions of Americans, and it's only going to get worse. It was a little over a year ago when Americans rose up, made their voices heard, and stopped Republicans from passing Trump Care. But ever since they were unable to repeal the Affordable Care Act on the Senate floor, this administration has pursued a cynical campaign to sabotage the Affordable Care Act from behind closed doors. The Trump administration slashed the open enrollment period, leaving Americans with less time to get covered. And to confuse consumers, they cut advertising and outreach funding. They abruptly eliminated cost-sharing payments, raising out-of-pocket expenses for many struggling families. Earlier this summer, they rolled back consumer protections and gave insurers permission to sell more junk health plans to consumers, plans that leave people more vulnerable to massive medical bills that bankrupt their families. And then they even intervened in a court case to have protections for pre-existing conditions struck down, jeopardizing coverage for 3.8 million New Jerseyans who have a pre-existing condition. Every act of sabotage has contributed to soaring health care premiums, fewer choices for consumers, and millions of Americans losing their health care coverage under this president's watch. But now we face President Trump's greatest act of sabotage yet, the nomination of a judge to the Supreme Court who has decried the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act at the very same time this administration is arguing in court that protections for pre-existing conditions are unconstitutional. Unconstitutional. As a candidate and as president, Donald Trump repeatedly pledged to protect people with pre-existing conditions, saying on 60 Minutes that he would, quote, take care of everybody. Now, before the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies could discriminate against any American who had a pre-existing condition. And what is that? That's some illness that you acquired in your life. It's that heart attack or the Parkinson's disease or the birth defect that you had when you were born that then allowed an insurance company to discriminate against you and either deny you health care coverage or make the cost so exorbitant that it was impossible to be able to afford. The Affordable Care Act that I helped write ultimately eliminated that discrimination and the ability of insurance companies to do that. And in New Jersey alone, which has a little over 9 million people in the state, 3.8 million New Jerseyans have a pre-existing condition. The president also said he replaced the Affordable Care Act with, and I quote, something terrific. Well, there's nothing terrific about breaking a promise that threatens the lives and livelihoods of millions of families. I remember when President Trump promised to stand up for the so-called forgotten man. But I guess he forgot about them when he signed a Republican tax scam into law, handing trillion-dollar tax cuts to big corporations at the expense of working families in New Jersey's middle class, taking away or limiting significantly our state and local property tax deduction. And he definitely forgot about the forgotten when he reversed his position on pre-existing condition protections. The administration's plot to derail the Affordable Care Act and the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh have implications for every family in America, no matter whether they're covered by an employer or by their own insurance on the marketplace. Now, people remember what it was like before we passed the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't so long ago that health care insurance companies could pick and choose who got covered and drop their customers the moment they got sick. Before the Affordable Care Act, women could be denied coverage for maternity care. Women in many parts of the country ultimately were discriminated against by being charged more than their male counterpart in the same age group, in the same geography, simply because they were women. Today, women no longer are considered a pre-existing condition under the law simply because they are a woman. Before the Affordable Care Act, babies born with heart deformities could hit lifetime limits within days of being born. Today, families don't have to worry about lifetime caps. Before the Affordable Care Act, cancer survivors and Americans with chronic conditions like diabetes or asthma could be charged exorbitant premiums and priced out of coverage altogether. Today, those patients are protected from discrimination. This guaranteed coverage for pre-existing conditions formed the very heart of the Affordable Care Act. But if confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh could drive a stake right through it. That's because this judge has a long history of ruling against consumers and for big corporations. And that doesn't bode well for the 133 million Americans who live with pre-existing conditions in this country. That includes those 3.8 million people in New Jersey. For me, that's 3.8 million reasons to oppose Kavanaugh's nomination, and that's before we even get to his hostile views with respect to Roe versus Wade. Make no mistake, the anti-choice, anti-Affordable Care Act, and anti-everyday American views of Judge Kavanaugh are not up for debate. President Trump has been crystal clear about only nominating judges opposed to Roe versus Wade and a woman's right to choose. So when I read reports about Judge Kavanaugh telling my colleagues here in the Senate that Roe versus Wade is quote-unquote settled law, I have to chuckle. Because let's be clear, his hollow words mean absolutely nothing. The Supreme Court has the power to unsettle so-called settled law whenever they make a ruling. And we've seen in the court's recent decisions, such as in the Janus case, where years of settled law all of a sudden became unsettled. Now, I don't question Judge Kavanaugh's experience or his intelligence, but I do question his history of partisanship and impartiality. I question his ability to put aside his decades of work in Republican politics. I question his connections to far-right groups that have spent decades rolling back women's constitutional rights and rigging our courts in favor of the rich and powerful. The American people deserve a Supreme Court justice who will defend their rights and strive for a legal system in which workers, consumers, patients, and families go to court on a level playing field at a time when powerful special interests are too often holding all the cards. Instead, they've been given a nominee groomed by right-wing organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society to do the bidding of their big corporate donors. It confirmed Donald Trump will have replaced the only swing vote on the Supreme Court with a partisan who only swings to the far right. And Brett Kavanaugh will be in a position to cast a deciding vote should the Trump administration's assault on the Affordable Care Act end up in the Supreme Court. That's frightening, and it's frustrating, especially because any one of my Republican colleagues have the power to make a real difference. Any one of my colleagues in the majority could demand we don't confirm a Supreme Court nominee until this administration stops its assault on the rights of patients with pre-existing conditions. Republicans claim they support these protections, but this is not a time for half-hearted statements. This is a time for action. If Republicans truly believed in preventing insurance companies from discriminating against patients who endured complicated pregnancies or survived cancer or have chronic disease, they would do something about it. Instead, as the Trump administration carries out this campaign of sabotage against the Affordable Care Act, my Republican colleagues are engaged in a campaign of silence and complicity. Because when you have the power to use your voice and your vote to protect millions of patients and families across this nation, and you choose not to do so, you are indeed complicit. It's sad and shameful that not a single Republican in this body has put their foot down and stand up for the rights of patients. Stand up for all of those millions of Americans who have a pre-existing condition. Failing, Madam President, could I ask for order?
Senate will be in order.
Failing to speak out means you're part of the problem. You're destabilizing our insurance markets and kicking millions off of their coverage. You're driving higher out-of-pocket costs for families and skyrocketing health care premiums. You're leaving Americans who struggled with opioid addiction or endured a sexual assault vulnerable to discrimination. You're enabling President Trump's worst instincts, which is to do whatever he pleases, whenever he pleases, with no regard for the rule of law or the role of Congress or the havoc he's wreaking on people's lives. Most Americans can't believe we have to refight the health care battles of the past. They want their leaders to work on building them a brighter future. There are so many ways we could be working to improve our health care system and making a real difference in the lives of our constituents. We could be passing legislation that ensures women have access to reproductive health care and the right to control their own bodies, no matter which state they live in, like the Women's Health Protection Act. We could be holding powerful drug companies accountable for price gouging consumers and playing fast and loose for the rules by passing common sense bills like the CREATES Act and the SPIKE Act. We could be pursuing reforms to reduce health care costs, not by reducing access to care, but by encouraging efficiency and becoming better at preventing and managing costly chronic disease. We could be creating more transparency so that patients headed to surgery can shop around before going under the knife with a wish and a prayer that they don't wake up to a massive medical bill. We could be pursuing solutions to reduce risk in the private marketplace and lower premiums for younger consumers, not by inflicting a punishing age tax, but by letting Americans 55 years and older buy into Medicare. But before we make our health care system better, we have to stop President Trump from making it worse. It's time we do the responsible thing. Put the brake on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. Tell the president his nominee won't get a hearing until he drops his legal assault on patients with pre-existing conditions. Demand that the administration stop playing games with American lives and stand up for the right of every man, woman, and child across America to quality, affordable health care. We have that opportunity in the Senate. I don't hear any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle raising their voice in the midst of an attack against the essence of the protections under the Affordable Care Act that we supposedly all collectively embraced, that the president heralded. But now that the president is directing his Justice Department to attack. It's time to speak up. And if not, then one is complicit. And if that ultimate attack against the Affordable Care Act is successful, then for 130 million Americans across this country who will no longer have those protections, I think they'll remember on Election Day. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Madam President, this body is about to vote on my resolution to protect nearly 800,000 West Virginians and millions of Americans from the dangerous lawsuit that 20 U.S. Attorney Generals, including my own Attorney General from West Virginia, are in financial jeopardy if they get sick. But we have an opportunity today to stand up for the millions of Americans with pre-existing